I'd like to talk to you today about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. Now, I've chosen those words carefully. We often hear about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but how often do we think about adding the word belonging? All children deserve to feel that they belong in their school, and so do all staff. A school can be diverse, inclusive, and even equitable, but unless a person feels like they belong, they won't be professionally fulfilled. And if that's the case, they're likely to leave, definitely the school and possibly the profession completely. I suggest as I change the slides that you pause to read them. So today I'd like us to consider a typical career path in teaching, from initial teacher training right through to system leadership. Along the way, we will consider teachers who embody these broad characteristics as shown on the slide. And spoiler alert, we'll see at what point in their career journey they might drop out of teaching and why that might be. Now, although we know a fair amount about gender distribution in teaching and school leadership, and more work has been done around race and ethnicity recently, there is a failure of national data collection and evaluation to include the full range of protected characteristics. The data analysis provided for categories other than gender and race is limited. Categories around LGBTQ plus characteristics and disability and neurodivergence are not included. So to an extent, I'll be extrapolating from what we know about some minority groups or from sectors other than education. So to summarise this slide, in a survey of around 16,000 teachers, Edurio examined to what extent people agreed that their school was inclusive, diverse and equitable. Less than half felt their workplace was diverse. Disabled staff, minority ethnic staff, and those with a faith other than Christianity felt less valued, and 40% of staff were not confident that career development decisions were free from bias. Interestingly, people in leadership positions were far more likely to think their school was truly inclusive than classroom teachers or middle leaders. And before we really get going, I'd like to say a word about intersectionality and privilege. Intersectionality is what we get when we consider how multiple identities interact, such as gender and race in women of colour. We can also hear a lot about checking our privilege, which can make us feel defensive, until we realise that in this context, the word privilege is used to denote a lack of disadvantage. Having white privilege doesn't mean you are only successful because you are white. It doesn't mean you haven't struggled or had to work hard. It simply means that your skin colour has not given you a societal disadvantage. I found a great description of this, if you'll allow me to read it. This is a quote from Chris Hildrew, the head teacher in Somerset, and he says, "I'm usually in the majority. I joke about how I have the privileged full house. White, male, English, straight, cisgender, middle class. My privilege does give me advantages. When I speak, people listen. They always have. I expect them to." It can feel uncomfortable to reflect on this, but we should. For myself, I have white privilege, I have able-bodied privilege, I have heterosexual cisgender privilege. I was brought up in a middle-class home and went to an excellent school. I was supported to go to university by parents who had also gone to university and so knew how the system worked. I own my home and have no caregiving responsibilities. That is a huge amount of privilege, much of which I have no control over. And on that note, I want to be clear that I'm not holding each of us personally responsible for any lack of diversity on our schools. We're talking here about structural societal issues. Having said that, when we are aware of these issues, we can take action to mitigate them. So back to our teachers. Please note that I've deliberately degendered these as much as possible, as intersectional data is not available, but do keep that intersectionality in mind. The percentages in brackets here are the percentage of people in the wider population with these characteristics. And when you look at these, consider that, menopause aside, all of these characteristics, including caregiving, albeit in a much less gendered way, exist in the children we teach. Those children deserve role models and to see themselves reflected in the staff in their schools. Please consider too that if only 3% of the population is, for example, LGBTQ+, If you have that identity, that can be a lonely place to be if you don't belong. Now, let's begin our teaching journey. So I'll explain what we're looking at here. These two graphs show very similar data. Firstly, that despite being overrepresented among applicants for initial teacher training, people of colour are considerably underrepresented in teaching. Secondly, that as people of colour progress through their teaching journey, at almost every stage they are less likely to be promoted than white people. In fact, in 2021-22, 60% of schools in England had an all-white teaching staff, with 86% of schools in England having an all-white senior leadership team. So if people of colour are more likely to apply for initial teacher training, but less likely to achieve QTS, why might that be? So these images are taken from a selection of local ITT providers' websites. Clearly, diversity has been considered for most of them, but still quite narrowly. We have multiple women of colour, but only one man who is white, and no visibly disabled people. I've also seen a promotional video posted by a local skip that featured only white people. There are multiple unseen barriers to successful recruitment to ITT for certain demographics, including people of colour being less likely to reach their potential in the current education system. There may also be more significant structural financial constraints. But the big one for me is that the complexity of the process and a lack of support and guidance can massively disadvantage some prospective applicants. Questions we should be asking ITT providers we work with could include whether they offer pre-application support, such as an explanation of the English school system for people who didn't grow up here, or support with using formal language on an application. We could also think about ITT interview accessibility. Does the provider clearly communicate expectations, for example, what to wear? Do they offer interview practice? Is it feasible to provide the interview questions in advance? Does the candidate have the choice of online or in person? Are there accessibility accommodations available, such as a quiet space, a private space, materials available in an accessible format? Do they require candidates to ask for these up front, or are they provided as standard? Is there acknowledgement and acceptance of neurodivergence? For example, candidates needing fidget toys. Do the interview panelists introduce themselves with their pronouns? And crucially, who is on the panel? And is the panel diverse racially, ethnically, by gender, or by age? All of these can help potential trainees feel welcomed and positive about teaching as a career, as well as helping to create a truly level playing field for candidates. So at this point, acceptance onto ITT, we've already lost one of our teachers. But more than that, is everybody feeling 100% positive about their career choice? No. We do have a few people who are feeling wobbly about it. Now, with the image on the left, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to assume that similar barriers will face people in other minority groups, such as LGBTQ plus trainees, who may also face feelings of isolation, discrimination in placement schools, and a lack of specific support, compounded by a lack of teacher educators who share their identity. In the image on the right, we can see how different groups of people feel different levels of confidence that all staff are treated equally in their workplace. You can see particular disparities between men and women, white and non-white, and disabled versus non-disabled. Now, the reason I'm including these images is because I'd like us to think about trainees in their placement schools. It only takes one bad placement for us to lose a trainee for good. So we should think about what barriers they might face. For example, disabled people may not be able to drive, and economically disadvantaged people may not be able to run a car. Are they being placed in schools accessible by public transport? That primary caregiver, are they able to get the kids to breakfast club and then get to school on time? Does our LGBTQ plus trainee feel safe in their faith school placement? And does the trainee's in-school mentor share any aspect of their identity? Can they relate to our trainees' experience in school and support them through their worries or difficulties? So, great news. We haven't lost anyone else, and we have 7 newly qualified teachers. But we haven't reassured anyone, and we do have 2 more people who are feeling wobbly, and they haven't even started working full-time in a school. But we now have our new classroom teachers. Are we setting them up to enjoy a truly sustainable career? We're living in a moment in time when trans people in particular are facing an increase in prejudice, discrimination, hate speech, and physical danger. In schools, we have moved from a post-Section 28 world into one where the DfE can issue draft guidance about gender questioning children that arguably breaches the Equality Act. But we shouldn't separate the T from the LGB. It is our responsibility as employers and colleagues to ensure that LGBTQ plus teachers are safe in school. This might look like revisiting our behaviour, equality and dignity at work policies and ensuring that they're fit for purpose, truly inclusive and robustly enforced every time. Have you consulted the people directly affected by these policies and asked them about their experience of the policies being enforced? Are the children and their parents and carers explicitly taught to be respectful and appreciative of diversity in all its forms, and a zero tolerance approach to discrimination and harassment modelled by all staff? We're also losing mothers from teaching at a damaging rate. So have a think. What is your school's parental leave policy like? How do you accommodate flexible working? Do you offer a hybrid PPA time, staggered starts or finishes, part-time or job share options? Do you offer a private lockable space for lactation? And how do people in your school talk about flexible working? As an inconvenience, a budget drain, a timetabling nightmare? Are disabled teachers fully accommodated in your school? Are reasonable adjustments made? Is there a budget for equipment to allow them to do their job effectively? Is there flexibility to amend lesson plans and classroom resources to make them more accessible? People's circumstances change, sometimes very quickly. Someone may become disabled or chronically ill. They may take on unforeseen caring responsibilities. They may change their name or pronouns. All of these changes can come with an element of fear, stress, grief, or anger. How do you, as a school, respond and accommodate these changes? Are you, as a leader, receptive, reflective, empathetic, and adaptable? And finally, for this section, do all of the policies, flexibility, and accommodations continue as teachers progress into middle leadership positions? And are those opportunities for promotion equitable? Because I guarantee that even if leaders think so, your staff don't. We know that women make up the majority of the teaching workforce, but we also know that primary caregivers are more likely to be female, without even thinking about further intersections of identity. If there was equity of opportunity in education, men wouldn't be twice as likely to progress into leadership. And here also, we see people of a non-dominant religion starting to lose confidence in a lack of bias. So let's say whoever remains in our cohort of teachers has now made it to middle leadership and are starting to think about senior leadership. Let's check in on them. The pool of applicants for senior leadership is dramatically smaller, and our person experiencing menopause is feeling wobbly about it. So I'd like us to think for a moment about how we recruit into senior leadership roles. Some years ago, there was a now famous Hewlett-Packard survey that found that women applied for promotion only when they believed they met 100% of the requirements on the job description, while men applied when they only met 60%. An American researcher found that men applied for head teacher roles when they thought they were about 50% ready, while women wanted to be nearer 100% ready. So what do our senior leadership job descriptions look like? Are all of those personal skills and experience on the person's specification really needed? And in fact, you can look at language across all job descriptions through a DEIB lens. I recently saw a senior leadership role advertised that asked for a satisfactory health and attendance record. Now, this is obviously not only subjective, but also ableist. Interviews for senior leadership roles tend to be similarly brutal. A 2-day process with various assignments, panels, and often a task to be completed in the evening between the 2 days. This overnight task is particularly problematic. It disadvantages people with disabilities or chronic illnesses, and it also disproportionately disadvantages women as they are more likely to be primary caregivers. A colleague I have was recently speaking about these interview processes and listed out tasks that he has personally added to recruitment days, but from which in actuality he learned nothing useful about candidates. We like to see how candidates perform under pressure, but are we more realistically in danger of breaking them or putting them off completely? So for the top 2 images, you really just need to look at the information I've circled. However, I would like you to read the bottom 2 images that speak about teachers going through menopause, referred to here as transition. It's really only in the past few years that all stages of menopause have been discussed openly, with symptoms, both physical and emotional, being truly talked about and understood by those not experiencing it. Menopause policies are still quite new, and I'm not sure anybody has yet worked out the best way to manage working through the menopause, particularly because it happens when people are at a stage in their life when they're more likely to be in a senior position in the workplace. But what we can do is adjust expectations. Being a head teacher is a difficult, high-pressure job, and nobody here is trying to minimise that. But flexible working isn't just for lower responsibility roles. Head teachers can job share. Head teachers can work to a hybrid model, and head teachers can and should model healthy and sustainable working patterns to their staff that are compatible with family life in all its diverse forms. Let's see what our newly recruited senior leadership team looks like. Is anyone surprised by this? If we perpetuate the status quo, we end up with schools in which leadership all look the same. And knowing what we know now, how confident are we that this one remaining teacher, our new head teacher, is in that position on completely objective merit? We really have no way of knowing if this particular head teacher is the best person for the job, when statistically they ended up as the only person for the job. Now, fortunately, there are other ways to be a system leader. These 3 charts show the makeup of staff working in research schools. As you can see, we are largely white women of a certain age. Anecdotally, of 4 large ITT providers recruiting and training in Norfolk, all 4 are led by women. And a quick survey of teaching school hubs across England showed that 62% are led by women. Now, SCIT, Teaching School Hub and Research School Directors don't necessarily do those roles full time, and many balance this responsibility alongside active teaching or school leadership roles. They aren't an easy option by any means. What they can offer, though, is better flexibility, hybrid or home working, more regular hours, and the opportunity to mould the role to a person's needs and preferences. Now, this increased flexibility means that we've now retained 2 more of our teachers in the system. Unfortunately, our other 5 teachers left the profession before they got to a level of seniority that would have made them even be considered for these roles. They left before they reached the level of seniority required to influence change to a system that did not make them feel they belonged. The 3 people we have left are now the people responsibility for setting organisational policies. They are responsible for senior leadership recruitment. And perhaps more importantly, They're the people responsible for recruiting, interviewing, and training the next generation of teachers. On the evidence, and without deliberate attention and change, it's quite likely that the next generation of teachers will look like these three people. If you'd like to learn more, these 4 books are a great place to start. And all of these resources are on the shared Padlet for this session. My slides and the key questions I've asked are on there, as are all the resources. There's also a link to Diverse Educators, an amazing organisation with a wealth of information and resources. Thank you for your time.